Hello and good morning, everybody in the room, and welcome everybody who's watching online. You're all very welcome to this Migration Policy Center seminar this morning. My name is Martin Roos, and I'll be chairing the seminar. The topic today is powerlessness and sovereign inequality in border externalization and the management of irregular migration in Europe. And I'm delighted to welcome our two speakers. The first one is Lucas Schmidt, who is a PhD researcher at the EUIS Department of Political and Social Sciences. And our second speaker is Philip Savadik, who is a postdoctoral researcher for the Migration Governance and Asylum Crisis, or the MAGIC project, at the Center for International Studies at Sciences Po in Paris. Welcome to both of you. Each of the speakers will present for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then there will be some time for discussions from both people in the room and people online. And if you're online, if you have questions, please post your questions in the chat on YouTube. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Lucas.
Thank you, Martin, for that very nice introduction. Let's see if we can get the technicalities sorted out. Yes, I think that's good, no? Yeah, okay. So this paper that I'm going to present is part of my PhD dissertation, which is in normative political theory, and tries to sort of reevaluate the normative legitimate authority of different migration control principles and instruments by taking into account sort of contextualizing information about the real world mechanisms and workings of the way in which migration is being governed. And this paper looks at border externalization as a practice of migration control in particular, and it tries to say something new about why the idea that these agreements, externalization agreements, hold binding authorities over their partner states might not always be normatively sound. And it's very much a work in progress with lots of gaps and problems. So looking forward to all helpful comments. So let me start by foreshadowing the talk, telling you how I will proceed. So yeah, I will just start by giving some background about why this is interesting, telling you what is my central claim here. And I will sort of describe and specify what I mean by border externalization more specifically, and I'll give an overview over sort of interstate border externalization politics. And then in the third part, I will actually come to my own argument, which will turn on what I call relative powerlessness and oppressive double binds. And it stems from a contribution made in feminist political theory. And I will first explain the theory, and then I will try to see if we can apply that theory to the thing that I'm talking about, which is border externalization. And then fourth, I will try to say something about the implications of this argument on the principle of sovereign equality on the international stage. And then in turn, I will try to say something about how these implications turn on the legitimate authority of these deals that I'm talking about. And then I'll conclude. Okay, so just to start with some background. So with exceptions, the political theory of migration and border control has an overwhelming tendency to sort of understand the relevant normative landscape as one that's demarcated by a state's relationship with and actions and dispositions towards refugees and migrants themselves. And the bi- and multilateral dimensions of immigration governance remain still normatively underexplored, I think, which is unfortunate because these dimensions affect international society in normatively interesting ways. And yeah, border externalization is just one particularly salient area of that general thought, as other areas in migration studies and policy and public discourse have recently been stressing the phenomenon and its mechanisms and its characteristics and its salience. So border externalization is often said to undermine human rights and enable states to avoid responsibility under international law. But what I want to argue is that there may well be another problem with it, and perhaps a more fundamental problem with at least some forms of border externalization. And that's a problem that surfaces when this practice entrenches deep power inequalities in interstate relations by way of degrading disadvantaged states' agential powers. So this is a very open-ended, broad claim, and I will specify it as we go on. And then I also suggest that this can't be reconciled with the principle, with the international order's fundamental principle of sovereign equality, and that contradiction in turn undermines the legitimate authority, that is the proper bindingness of the agreements in question. Okay, so let me start by describing the phenomenon in a more precise way. So of course, definitions of border externalizations are pretty contested. There's multiple, but I think for my purposes, this will do. So Moreno, Lax, and Lemberg-Peterson say that the externalization of border control can be defined as the range of processes whereby actors and states complement policies to control migration across their territorial boundaries with initiatives that realize such control extraterritorially and through other countries and organs rather than their own. Now, states do this, they externalize their borders in various different ways. For example, by deputizing private actors to do some of their border control work, through legal regimes or through monetary incentives. So carrier sanctions are the most sort of well-known example of this, I think. Or also by availing themselves of the services of international organizations, such as the International Organization of Migration. What I'm interested here, though, is best specified as interstate externalization agreements or deals, or as politicians like to call it, interstate migration management agreements or deals. Now, these deals can first be predominantly aiding, which I take to mean that they represent sort of state building, sponsoring agreements that include migration control specific stipulations. So where foreign states are ramping up of bordering capacities is just one of the many different things that is financed by sort of an externalizing sponsor state. For example, many programs in the EU Trust Fund for Africa are like that, I think. But they are also often predominantly transactional, where the agreement is specifically intended to contain and hamper sort of irregular migrant mobility before migrants reach the territorial borders of that contracting state, which is seen to be the migration influx state. And of course, there's famous examples like the Italy-Libya Memorandum of Understanding, the Australia-Nauru Memorandum of Understanding, also the EU-Turkey statement, the 2016 statement. So now I will argue that many of these agreements are fundamentally objectionable when and because they entrench one of its partners' relative powerlessness in a certain to be specified way. But it's important to first briefly introduce sort of the complex and variant empirical grounds that this argument needs to be based on. And actually, the politics of externalization agreements and their immediate effects on interstate relations are not clear-cut at all. So on the one hand, there is some serious evidence that suggests that global North states often have intentions and capabilities to get global South states to agree to externalization deals against their wills or against their more fundamental interests. Now, in the example of the US's migration protection protocols, for example, or the Remain in Mexico policy, for instance, Mexico's assent to that, to receiving migrants expulsed from US territory was practically forced with military presence at the border and so on. In another example, the EUTF's aid money is often conditional on the enforcement of certain migration management structures that undermine some of the professed long-term policy goals of the actors bound to receive this money. So for example, in Northern and Western Africa, some of these practices said to undermine long-standing regional cooperation models that strive towards regional free movement. But there is also evidence that Global South as cooperating states can actually be quite forcefully assertive, sort of empowered by the geopolitical salience ascribed to them in these negotiations. So they often manage to extract important benefits from such deals, or they selectively fail to implement agreed upon deals to their benefit. And sometimes they also just refuse cooperation when their demands aren't met. So the way in which the bargaining power is distributed seems to differ somewhat between different cases. And there are a range of cases in which Global South states can make use of so-called migration diplomacy to assert considerable influence. So prime cases are, of course, the EU-Turkey statement, but also, for example, Morocco's rejection of EU money in exchange for heightened sea patrol activities and so-called foot dragging on the implementation of agreed upon measures in the Sahel zone. So based on this picture, it seems quite challenging and maybe misguided to want to reach any general normative conclusions about the desirability of externalization agreements judged against the background of their effects on interstate relations. And I think it's true that nothing to such very general effect can be said that applies blanketly to all sort of individual agreements. But I also think we can nevertheless formulate a critique that, that captures at least a wide range of these agreements, though not all of them, based on the same argumentative strategy. And I think that this strategy, a good strategy to do so, is uncovering and illuminating the choice situations that relatively powerless states, usually Global South states, are often put in by more powerful Global North states that want to externalize their migration control and the consequences of having to navigate such choice situations. And to do so, what I do in the paper is I begin with an insight from feminist political theory from back in the 80s. So what I'm concerned with in the argument relates deeply to the relative power disparities between states, so to power and powerlessness. According to feminist political theorist Iris Marion Young, powerlessness is a specific instance of the wider phenomenon of oppression. And that wider phenomenon materializes often in the lives of oppressed agents by the necessity of having to confront what Marilyn Fry in 1983 called doublebinds in decision-making processes. And she says that doublebinds are choice situations where genuine options are few and all of them likely expose the agent to penalty, censure, or deprivation. Now, while I think this idea is crucial to understanding the challenges of oppression, the formulation is still rather unspecified and open-ended and has stayed so until recently, where a theorist called Sukaina Hiri has made this, has thought more about the specificities of the concept. And I'm sorry for the very long quote, but I think it's important, so I included the whole quote and I'm gonna read it out. So she says that the key to understanding doublebinds is to appreciate how, when an agent is a member of an oppressed group, the two goods at stake in their choice, their prudential good and their resistance to oppression, are often bound up together. So if they cooperate, they reinforce the very oppressive norm that in the long run controls their access to security and power. If they resist, they are likely to face immediate harm or sanction for stepping out of line, and in general to be put in a position where their long-term ability to resist oppression is undermined. So on either option, they are forced to act against themselves, becoming a tool or a mechanism in their own oppression. Now, this is pretty abstract, of course. So to make it more concrete, more vivid, let's apply it to one of the paradigmatic intended examples, which is women's choices under patriarchy. And to take a particularly grueling example, particularly grueling choice situation, let's take that of a woman who is being forced to choose whether to give in to a man's unwanted sexual advances or to refuse such advances, assuming a background situation in which the man has considerable powers over her future, and she has reason to believe, though not necessarily certainty, that he wouldn't shy away from using those powers accordingly as a response to her decision. Now notice that here giving in to such unwanted advances might well hold significant short-term benefits. So the woman might avoid sanctions, she might manage to be seen favorably by someone with significant control over her life opportunities. But of course, doing so also comes at very serious costs, one of which is the reinforcement of the very oppressive gendered sexual norms that constrain her freedoms and opportunities in the first place and in the long run. Indeed, it seems like resisting the unwanted advance may be the only available course of action that's suitable to undermining these prevailing oppressive norms. But again, doing so may come at a heavy cost, including the danger of facing immediate repercussions that harm both her material or potential interests, for example, a diminution of social status or access to socioeconomic opportunities, and in virtue of such prudential setbacks, her ability to resist similar oppressive situations effectively in the future. Now, I think what this makes clear is that the distinctive feature of the oppressive double bind is that it forces the agent to become complicit with their own oppression. So it is simply the case then that whatever they do ends up as a mechanism in their undermining of their own objective interests. And so ultimately what double binds reveal is that an agent can lack some important dimension of freedom even when they're acting in a fully informed and rational way, when they can select voluntarily from among a range of options, and when they're acting in line with their own deeply held values or commitments. Now, I want to suggest that we can make the very big leap and take that analysis and apply it to a lot of what we see in border externalization. So specifically, yes, I think we can transpose that onto the choice situations relatively powerless states face in bargaining situations that lead up to such deals. Now, there's a very crude hypothetical case that I first want to consider, and then we'll see how actual examples fit in with that crude hypothetical case. So according to the hypothetical case, when Global South states accept externalization deals that are pursued aggressively and in ways that make it reasonable to suspect that sanctions, censure, or deprivation will occur when deals are refused, they undermine their own fundamental interest in becoming equally powerful as other more advantaged states over time by reinforcing the very oppressive norm, which is that they are to be passive when it comes to developing and engaging in international relations that controls their access to this interest in the long run, even though they might gain short-term advantages, financial or otherwise. Now, when they refuse deals, they undermine, again, their long-term ability to resist the oppressive status quo, that is, their relative powerlessness in the international arena, by exposing themselves to deprivation and sanction, even though they might also gain respect by insisting on their interests and do what is necessary not to feed the oppressive norm. Now, as crude and as simple as this picture is, I think it's fair to say that even this hypothetical already applies to some real-world externalization deals pretty adequately. So one example is unilaterally formulated US migration policy to extend its migration management frontier through most of Latin America, where the US made very clear that crucial aid assistance to countries in dire straits, such as El Salvador, was dependent on compliance with and implementation of this policy, and without real negotiation of the policy. Another example seems to be the Australia-Nauru externalization deals, which appear to be practically unilaterally formulated by Australia, and which, according to some estimates, generate up to 2/3 of Nauru's yearly revenue, thus making its well-being seemingly completely dependent on further cooperation. Now, in both cases, I think it's very plausible to say that further cooperation entrenches relative powerlessness by accepting serious disadvantage on the international stage, and refusing to cooperate is likely to lead to severe deprivation, thereby entrenching relative powerlessness again over time by making oneself, vulnerable to deprivation from crucial resources that one needs in order to fight relative powerlessness. But there are also cases that are more descriptively complex, such as those that involve foot dragging in implementation and sort of a genuine back and forth in negotiations. I think probably some of those, at least some of those, may also be captured in the relevant parts by the hypothetical analysis. Now, foot dragging, for example, happens after a deal's conclusion, and so it doesn't directly tell us anything about the choice situation through which it came about. And I think something similar is true about cases in which negotiations lead to significant concessions for the global South state, or in which it flat out refuses. Now, what matters again is not just the extent of concessions gained or the mere fact of refusal, but whether the offer's ultimate acceptance or refusal both undermine the ability of a state constrained by relative powerlessness to resist this powerlessness. So while I do think, 5 minutes, yeah. While I do think that it's likely that the analysis will fit even some descriptively more complex cases characterized by genuine negotiations or refusal to assent, I do think it might fit, but this depends in the end on more comprehensive sort of case-by-case empirical analysis that I can't provide in the paper. But also there's limits to this analysis, of course, very clear limits. And so I think it doesn't apply to cases that the literature has described as coercive migration diplomacy. So there are cases in which the global South state, who is in negotiations to perform externalized border control, has an active and agenda setting and agenda shaping role. And it's itself the actor that is able and willing to threaten its partners with bad consequences if a deal isn't achieved. In such cases, neither potential outcome will, entrench relative powerlessness compared to the partner state. And so the choice situation given there can't be characterized as an oppressive double bind. I think the clearest example of this rather exceptional type of externalization deal is the EU-Turkey statement. But there might also be, it might also fit to Libya's cooperation with Italy and the EU under Gaddafi. But I'm not sure about this. Okay, so let me just finish by talking a bit more about the normative conclusions that I think this diagnosis allows. So I think one thing is clear, which is both in terms of logical cogency and accepted standards of the international order. It's clear that interstate treaties can't establish proper bindingness when they're based on or arise from processes that contradict the fundamental conventions of the international order. There's clear precedence for this also, for instance, in the case of the odious debts doctrine, which says that debt obligations can't arise from money loaned to commit mass-scale, human rights violations, which are, of course, are contradictory to the fundamental principles of the international system. Now, of course, externalization deals are not generally binding treaties, but I want to treat them as such, just for argument's sake, to suggest that the relevant deals couldn't generate a legitimate claim to proper bindingness, even if they were put in treaty form. But so back to our case, I think the fundamental convention that's violated by powerlessness entrenching double binds in interstate externalization bargaining is plausibly that of sovereign equality, which is the principle that all states possess fundamentally equal status relative to each other. Now, it's of course generally accepted that a mere differential in de facto power isn't isn't generally a violation of the principle of sovereign equality. But in our case, I think what powerless entrenching double binds do is that they force one state to itself contribute to the reproduction of its own de facto inferiority relative to another state. And I think that is clearly, I mean, it's clearly in itself normatively objectionable, but I think that there's also a good case to be made that it is objectionable on the international political system's own fundamental grounds, as it so fundamentally undermines the spirit, I think, of sovereign equality. If this is plausible, then I think there is at least strong pro tanto, though not necessarily all things considered, reason to think that such deals lack legitimate authority, that is proper bindingness, and that as a result, they need not, normatively speaking, be complied with. All right, so to very quickly sum up, what I've argued is that there are more reasons to object to interstate order externalization agreements than just their allegedly bad consequences for refugee protection and states' responsibilities under international law. In particular, I've suggested that we should pay closer attention to the extent to which the global north's pursuit of such agreements degrades the agential powers of relatively powerless partner states, because I think doing so reveals a set of instances in which such weaker states are forced to act against their own fundamental sovereign interests. And just to end by looking beyond this paper and towards other areas of concern, I think there's reason to believe that this kind of analysis may also apply to other interstate bargaining situations, such as those constitutive of trade treaties, investment treaties. So many more agreements may actually face normative legitimacy deficits than I've been able to suggest. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Lucas, for a really interesting, clear, and very thought-provoking presentation. We've got about 15 to 20 minutes for questions now. If you're online and if you have a question, please post your question in the chat box on YouTube. And I'll first turn to the audience in the room here. Andrew?
Thanks, Lucas. It's a really interesting paper. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to read it before the seminar, so apologies for questions of things you've addressed. But first of all, I want to go to your hypothesis, and I think you might want to develop that a little bit more, because you kind of just have this idea of the global north, the global south, and actually a lot of the actions and activities that you identify have quite significant domestic political effects as well, because there are very significant amounts of resource that can change political dynamics in the states that are the objects of these interventions. And so one way of thinking about that, which I thought has been developed in South America, but I think could have more general relevance, is that it seems to me you have in mind a group of states that are powerful and a group of states that are powerless. But in South America, there's interesting work which talks about many states falling into what's called a middle quality institutional trap, where there are democratic norms, perhaps with weaknesses in the effect of those democratic norms, and also significant capacity issues in states. But you seem to have this kind of binary between the kind of powerful and the powerless. And yet in South America, I think many states will fall into this kind of middle quality situation where issues around state capacity are relevant and where significant influxes of resource can have quite important domestic political implications. I think that really is how you specify your hypothesis, and in a way what you refer to yourself as kind of this maybe crude distinction. And I don't think it necessarily affects the argument you're making, but I think it would allow maybe to develop it a little bit more and maybe offset this issue perhaps of the binary that you construct.
All right, thank you. And I suggest you take 2 or 3 questions at a time, if that's okay, in the interest of time. So Fabian had a question. Yeah.
Personally, so having worked in this field of migration for 2 decades now from European side and the European Commission, I am convinced that you could develop the argument you're developing very easily also from the other side. That in fact, you could also construct the argument that the European Union is becoming more and more vulnerable to migration pressure, because we as the EU, we are a unique region thanks to our fundamental values and the treatment we are granting asylum seekers, that everybody who comes to our borders and asks for protection is allowed entry. I mean, unless you happen to be subject of an illegal pushback, but this is not the rule. So anyone coming is allowed entry and will probably not be returned in most of the cases. So this, and we are very unique in that respect globally. And our neighboring countries, and particularly the countries producing migratory flows, know about this fact and know how vulnerable the EU is, increasingly is. And this is then used as a huge leverage by our neighboring regions. We've seen it for Belarus 2 years ago, this incidents of instrumentalization, inviting Iraqis to come and move on. So we are really, the EU is in a situation of vulnerability and weakness, if you want to describe it that way. You could look at it. I'm not saying that's the absolute truth, but you can also look at it that way. I would like to raise your attention to that point. Thanks.
All right, if Lucas is okay with you, we'll take a few more, because I see that there are also questions coming in online, and I want to make sure we finish on time for the second paper.
Might just not be able to respond to everything if we take, but I'll pick and choose. That's good for me anyways.
I'll take 2 more from the room at this stage, Christoph and then James.
Yes, I agree. This is a really interesting approach. I was wondering about your unit of analysis. I mean, you're looking at the state, but what is the state in terms of legitimacy for these externalization practices? In my work, we have seen that the state is much more than just the government. And I think also other migration scholars would agree that there's a huge domestic set of institutions that interacts with these externalization practices that are that gain opportunity by engaging with the more powerful actor, but at the same time they may become more dependent. But then there is not a real double-bind thing here happening. It's more like a conscious decision. It's a rational cost-benefit analysis that guides these seemingly powerless actors. And then I would encourage you to go a little broader on your stylized distinction between powerlessness, as Fabian has just highlighted, and agency, like with the CMD, like the coercive migration diplomacy, because there are cases in between, right? Thank you.
Thank you. And James?
Yeah, I think my question was kind of covered by the last one, so I'll just be quick. I think it's a really interesting topic, and you raised a lot of interesting theoretical points. I would just really dig into this a priori assumption that the global north is one thing, strong and bad, and the global south is another thing, weak and not so bad. And where that really becomes a problem is when you bring up the Turkey issue, because then you say, in the presentation at least, well, it's just not so true for Turkey and some other, and there was another case you gave as well. I can't remember if it was Gaddafi. So, I mean, I would really dig into like the sort of a priori assumptions on those two, and then, for example, Morocco you gave us a different thing. I mean, why are they different?
Okay. Do you want to go into the second round? Is that okay? We'll do a second round. Yeah. Do you want to respond to some of this very briefly, please? And then we'll go.
Sorry, Mike. Yes, maybe I'll start. Thanks, everyone. There's a lot of stuff to think about. Maybe I'll start by answering the only direct question, which is what is the level of reasoning? Is it supposed to be a legal reasoning, a moral reasoning, a political reasoning? Which is, I want to be very clear that this paper does not engage in any actual legal reasoning. I'm sure lawyers, in virtue of what the law says, are probably not convinced by this as a legal argument. It is a normative argument that is based in moral philosophy. I am trying to sort of attune it to legal, political, internal standards of the international system to make it palatable for a wide range of views. So I could engage in many other different kinds of reasoning, for example, about the exploitativeness of some kind of deals that have less grounding in sort of the international order's own principles and would thus, I think, be less convincing to a lot of people. But yes, it's not a strictly speaking legal argument. As to the other comments, I don't have too much to say. It's a lot of interesting stuff to take on board. I am aware that the global north, global south distinction is very crude and it's not analytically sharp. It's just that I make some of these, and it's the same goes for my kind of very superficial view of what a state is and if there are such a thing as state interests, objectively speaking. This is all pretty undifferentiated. I realize this, it's just because I do it, because if I didn't do it, if I was more differentiated on all these things, I fear that the paper would run out of bounds. It's already a long paper, but I do realize that I have to be more careful with this. And I'll just say thanks for the other things.
Okay, thank you. We'll do a second round of questions, Philip, and then we'll go online.
Just very quickly, I was wondering how you define sort of the interests of a state. Is it not in Nauru's interest to take all this money from Australia? And in a counterfactual situation, if they didn't, perhaps Nauru would be very worse off. And it seems like below that you're implying we shouldn't be warehousing refugees in Nauru, and that's a fundamental injustice, rather than necessarily that's an injustice for Nauru. And can Nauru ever be really as powerful as Australia? It seems unlikely, just given physical, geographic reality. So what is in Nauru's real interest is sort of what came to my mind. But thank you.
Thank you. We've got one question from the chat. You can also see it actually if you can read it. So the first question is about to what extent, how your analysis would relate to the UK-Rwanda deal and whether that is not an example where actually Rwanda was buying UK silence on its role in the DRC, as the question suggests here. Also, second question about the non-implementation or reluctant implementation. If anybody else is online and would like to raise a question, please post it in the chat. The questions will then be relayed to me. And while we're waiting for other questions online, I will add my own question briefly. So what I would say is, so this second part of Doublebind, I think it was the second part where you said that if compliance or if an agreement contributes to the reproduction or the entrenchment of the, I mean, to some extent, that is, of course, an empirical question. I mean, in some cases, it will be clear cut, but in other cases, so if you take a country that has migration cooperation, trade cooperation, all kinds of different cooperation, whether or not cooperation in one particular field entrenches these inequalities I would say, is partly an empirical question. And the related question is then, well, if we kind of, look at reality and say, look, I mean, fact is that there are these economic differences from an economic perspective. If you define kind of powerlessness just vis-a-vis economic resources and economic power, so we have these inequalities. So what's the implication of the argument? What are these states left to do? If it's objectionable that they strike migration deals, if they're potentially objectionable, they strike trade deals because they could also qualify the global south. I mean, the weaker parts. Well, are those weaker states not? Is the implication those weaker states are then in a way not? It's morally objectionable if they engage with the richer countries on some of those issues, even if they self would actually express a preference for engaging. Okay, I don't see any other questions online. Why don't you respond to those so far?
Maybe I'll start with your last point because it's the most immediate to me right now. What are these states to do? I mean, the argument is not saying that they don't have, all things considered, reason to engage in these agreements. The argument is just, the only normative conclusion of the argument is that they don't have, that there's a good plausible case to be made that they don't have obligations to comply with them if they feel like it's not in their interest. Now, all things considered, if they feel that that is in their interest, they might well have reason to engage with them. And I'm not making a judgment about that, if they should or they shouldn't. Okay, maybe I'll take the UK-Rwanda deal. Yeah, I had included the UK-Rwanda deal as an example in earlier versions of the paper, but there seem to be some weird things about this deal that don't track a lot of the other deals that we see. So I have left it out of the paper now just because I feel like I'm not qualified to make a sort of a confident judgment about that particular deal. So I don't know about that. Then there was a question about proper implementation. Yeah, that pertains to what I described as foot dragging, right? So there are cases of where agreements are being made that are then not properly implemented. Yes, as I said, I think this is kind of incidental to my argument about the choice situation, because it doesn't pertain to the choice situation, but to something else that happens afterwards. And then finally, sorry, Martin, I know you had another point, but finally about the interests. Yeah, that is one of the big issues with the paper. I think there's still a big conceptual issue, with power, because I don't say what is power, who's entitled to how much power, what is the background, the baseline. And then the second is about interest. So my feeling is that that this argument requires an objective account of interest. So the argument requires to say that if Nauru says, well, it is in our interest to be a refugee rentier state and to just take all this money and prop up our state with that and become dependent on that, I think the argument requires me to say that, well, Nauru is just mistaken about what is in its own objective interest. Now, of course, this has its own problems, that kind of reasoning. But yes, this remains to be worked out better. So thanks for raising it. You are not the first one, and you will probably not be the last one until I fix this issue. But thanks, good point.
All right. Well, thank you very much to everybody who's raised questions. Thank you for the paper. We'll move on now to the second paper.
Thank you.
Philip. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to present today. What I will present is a section of my PhD, which I defended just over a year ago. I'm now reworking it to try to working my dissertation to try to transform it into a book manuscript or potentially papers. So I've drawn on my work there into paper form. So I'm very interested in hearing your reactions. I haven't had many opportunities for various reasons to present it previously. So again, thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here and to hear some comments on my work. Basically, the central question that I ask in this paper is, how do European states address irregular migration, and how has their management of such migration evolved over time? By irregular migration, which I define in the paper, I mean any migration that runs counter to the rules and regulations implemented by destination states that govern entry or residence in their state by non-citizens. Relatedly, I'm also asked the question, has there been convergence in the management of irregular migration across Europe? Which, as I'll discuss in a moment, I argue is very, if it is true, is very remarkable and puzzling, and calls for further explanation. So I start with, if you look, just historically, anecdotally, it seems like in Europe, states have increasingly been addressing irregular migration in similar ways. On the screen, you see a document I found in the National Archives of France doing archival research. And I thought it was a great illustration. It says, fake papers. If you're a foreigner who entered before the 1st of January 1981, come and your situation will be regularized. You'll get real papers. And so this is an illustration. In France in 1981 had a major regularization program where they granted individuals who didn't have regular status. But Spain and Italy, in fact, are countries that have adopted these measures even more than France in the past. But if you look today, it seems like we don't see these types of policies implemented anymore. Instead, we have there's a journalistic accounts, NGO accounts, referring to what is called Fortress Europe, alluding to Nazi fortification of European continent during World War II, and as well as to the barriers today that are going up between Hungary and Serbia and the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla otherwise, and in the general implementation of very coercive policies across the board to try to address irregular migration. So it seems like there's been convergence. If you look at the historical record, as you look at what's happening today. If this is the case, I argue that this is actually, you might say, okay, that's fine. But I would argue that it's actually quite remarkable for a number of reasons. First, European states are exposed to irregular migration to very varied extents. So you would potentially assume that if depending on exposure, you would have different types of reactions to irregular migration. In general, you would think that irregular migration has primarily domestic impacts. In studies of policy diffusion, you primarily think of, when one state or one jurisdiction adopts a certain policy, there are clear externalities for its neighbors, and then those states in turn adopt that policy, and then you have a spread. But with irregular migration, it isn't quite so clear cut what those externalities are. It doesn't automatically mean that if one state adopts a certain restrictive policy, that irregular migrations go to all of their neighbors, which would then lead them to adopt the same policy. Other states might willingly accept the irregular migrants that are coming, or irregular migrants might stay in the country of origin rather than going neighbors. So the spillover effects aren't so clear, and you wouldn't necessarily expect diffusion and convergence. Public opinion might be different. While studies of public opinion have demonstrated that there's a general hostility to irregular, unauthorized, illegal, all these words, this type of migration, there isn't a lot of studies that show that there's uniformity in the way that publics believe this should be dealt with. They don't all believe necessarily the regularizations are okay or not okay, or there's no evidence that that's necessarily the case. Although that might be true, but there might be diversity in opinions. And lastly, studies of migration policy development have often talked about the importance of interest groups with domestic interest groups in sort of influencing the outcome of migration policies. So those interest groups that benefit potentially from irregular migration because of the low labor costs that it represents might have power to influence policy outcomes. And so here I have a map that shows, this is not in the paper, but just I thought it was a nice illustration using Eurostat data, the percentage of employment in 2015 represented by agriculture, construction, wholesale and retail, trade, transport, accommodation and food services, economic sectors that are commonly associated with the employment of individuals who don't have a regular migration status. And you can see the variation across Europe. It goes from a low of about 25% in Germany, Belgium, and Sweden, up to a max in Romania nearly 55%. So just as a snapshot, as one metric, there are other metrics. There's the importance of economic sectors, a very powerful interest group that often is featured a lot in studies of migration policy. You would think that they have a lot more influence in those countries where they employ more of the population and where they may contribute a greater share of general economic development and economic activity. So given the potentially variable power of interest groups that have a different relationship with irregular migration, you would expect different irregular migration policies. So next, this is what are irregular migration policies that I've just been talking about. This is a very broad concept and not, there isn't like a set definition that's accepted broadly in the literature. So I just propose that irregular migration policies are any legislative measure which primarily aim to reduce the likelihood that any non-citizen can enter and or remain in a state in a manner that does not accord with that state's established procedures for entry and or residence. What I'm trying to do with this definition is clearly establish the scope of what is a policy that's particularly, what is a public policy particularly targeting this type of migration. So just for example, a policy expanding reasons that an individual is granted asylum, or a policy that restricts opportunities for an individual to obtain a work visa. Those would not fall under the definition. But policies like requiring all asylum seekers to provide fingerprints, that would, as its main objective is to reduce the likelihood that a person who doesn't, a non-citizen who doesn't obtain asylum, doesn't remain in the state subsequent that decision, or imposing fines on employers who hire individuals with an irregular status. The primary objective there is to reduce the likelihood, again, that a non-citizen enters or remains in the state that in a way that doesn't accord with the migration governance. So that's my proposed definition. That's how I move forward with my study. But this is still, encompassing a very broad array of policies. And so what I do next is I propose a typology of what I call approaches to irregular migration management, in order to sort of help us conceptualize what these policies are and to better sort of understand and study them. So I argue that irregular migration policies, they can be adopted to pursue one of two objectives. One is identification, meaning they can try to address irregular migration that has already occurred, or prevention, stop irregular migration from occurring in the first place. So mutually exclusive goals. On the other hand, you can have two strategies for achieving those goals, what I call punitive, so trying coercing compliance, forcing compliance with policies, or accommodating, these are my terms, changing incentives. So try to incentivize individuals to either leave irregularity, leave their regular status, or to not enter into irregular status. And then I label these four potential approaches: punishing, forgiving, suffocating, and mitigating. So next, we have the four approaches. Then what I argue is that there are 13 types of policy tools. I call them policy tools. The adoption of which is sort of an observable implication that a state is pursuing one of these approaches. So, for example, if a state is adopting policies to detect, detain, deport, or actually sanction, imprison, fine individuals, those are observable implications that the state is pursuing a punishing approach. So it's coercing individuals into compliance with rules, and it's dealing with irregular migration that's already occurred, right? Regularizations and voluntary returns, they've demonstrated forgiving approach. So individuals are already in irregular status, but it's incentivizing compliance with rules and drawing individuals out of irregularity. And then I won't go into each of these, but these are the 13 policy tools. In the interest of time, we can go back into them. So if states are adopting these types of policies, then I argue they're pursuing these types of approaches to addressing this issue. One interesting, interesting and useful aspect of the typology is that it helps highlight the consequences of adopting particular policies and then subsequently adopting particular approaches. Each, I argue, has particular effects on individuals, markets, on politics, and specific costs for governments. So I'll just do, for the punishing, right, it's harmful for individuals. It's very traumatic for individuals who are detained, deported, fined, imprisoned, etc. For markets, it could potentially inspire labor shortages and rising labor costs. For politics, this is all very schematic, but it can appease nativist groups, but outrage individuals who are concerned about migrant human rights. And the costs are potentially very high for governments, which have to implement detention policies, create detention centers, deport individuals, etc. And so, again, in the interest of time, I won't go into each of these, but each approach has different consequences, which I think are interesting to potentially unpack in the future. Finally, in the last sort of segment of the paper, I develop an irregular migration policy data set. Something that I coded. I coded the irregular migration policies adopted between 1945 and 2016 by 16 European democracies. Those are the countries on the map that are highlighted. I selected the countries on 5 different metrics: migration experience, when they acceded into the EU and Schengen area, the year that they democratized, vary on economic and wealth conditions and political economic institutions, following the varieties of capitalism sort of typology. As I'll mention in the end, obviously, I hope to expand the data set both temporally and geographically, but for now, this is what I have. To code the data set, you have the approach, then you have those 13 policy tools, and then what I looked at is different components of each tool. And I coded each component sort of for each tool, depending on if there are multiple components, from 1 to 5, with 5 indicating higher values, higher values, right? So 5 indicating higher commitment to addressing irregular migration. And then I took just simply the average coding of each component up to a tool if that was necessary, and then an average up to the approach. I relied on numerous sources to identify the different policies and to adopt the coding. I was very inspired here by Margaret Peters's data set, which was about fundamentally about regular low-scale migration policies. And so I basically took her code book and reformulated it in a way that would work for a specific coding of irregular migration policies. This is just one snapshot of the code book for regularizations. So you have, 5 means that there are large regularizations are very common, very highly accessible to individuals. Basically, anyone can obtain regular status if they'd like to be regularized, etc. And then 1 meaning that there are no regularization policies, or that they're very, very highly limited and circumscribed. And then in between, I have different levels. Lastly, using this data set, what I'm interested in is to assess whether there's been convergence in approaches over time, which I argued earlier would be very puzzling. In terms of defining convergence, I take this one prominent definition: any increase in the similarity between one or more characteristics of a certain policy across a given set of political jurisdictions over a given period of time. In other words, the end result of a process of policy change over time towards some common point, regardless of the causal process. So essentially, certain jurisdictions over a certain period of time getting similar in one of these 5 possible ways: policy goals, policy content, policy instruments, policy outcomes, or policy style. The last one referring to the way the policies are developed. In my case, I'm looking at policy instruments and policy goals. So the policies themselves are the instruments that are adopted over time, but they're also, as according with my typology, referring to certain goals. that states may have in terms of how to address irregular migration. So, right, the time space, right, inclusion, 16 democracies from that period, as I mentioned earlier. And I'm looking at what has been called sigma convergence, just simply is there a decrease in the variance for the different approaches that I've defined over time. And so here on the screen, you see sort of the coding across the 16 countries over time with the different approach. It's a little difficult to see, but I think you can see sort of in particular certain waves of periods of time when states adopted regularizations and then stopped adopting regularization policies. Here on this screen, you see just the average. The average for all the countries together, and you can see sort of the coding. More over time, more and more states are adopting suffocating and punishing approaches, and you see sort of two major humps in the forgiving approach. Sort of when certain primarily Northern European states adopted regularizations in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then later in the 90s and 2000s, the Mediterranean, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece adopted many regularization policies. And that period, mitigating, I quoted it as sort of a policy that wasn't very present in the past and becoming more prevalent. Here, looking at variance of the coding, so you can see those two humps and sort of a decline over time, demonstrating convergence with mitigating not really following convergence. Some states have applied that approach more than others. And here it's the same data, just visualized in 5-year groupings, these box plots, and you can sort of, as the box plots become more narrow, you can sort of see convergence over time. So in conclusion, I think I argue that puzzling convergence has indeed occurred. You have a shift towards punishing, suffocating approaches, an abandonment of forgiving approaches. And this is very puzzling, so I think it calls for explanation. Why is this happening? And then so for future, for the next steps, I argue I think it'd be important to expand this data set to really come to a more profound conclusion. I think it's already interesting that there is convergence in this diverse set of European states, but I would hope to expand to non-European states, other European states as well, examine why convergence has occurred. And as a final point, I'll say this only looks at whether states have adopted relevant policies. But of course, that doesn't mean that these policies are subsequently implemented, that these particular approaches are implemented. And so that it's not to say that this particular approach or this policy is actually on the ground changing realities and changing and leading to those consequences that I presented in an earlier slide. And so obviously implementation is very important. That said, though, I would argue that adoption is also something of interest. The governments feel like they need to adopt a particular policy is in itself an act that is of significance and is curious, again, given the variations in exposure and in economic conditions that I mentioned earlier. So, but of course, at some point, I think it'd be important to look at implementation, and that is potential caveat to add to the paper, recognize that the limitation of what I'm looking. All right, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Fantastic. Thanks for this really interesting presentation and great new data set. We'll again take questions from the room first. Martin. I think maybe we switch microphones. Yeah, apologies, you're online. Issue with the mic.
Okay, well, let's try. I'll just continue with this one. So in principle, I think you have a four-dimensional model rather than a two-dimensional model, right? Because your typology suggests that there are two dimensions, right? But actually, on your objectives, you have identification and prevention, but actually states on prevention can be either suffocating or not, and on identification, they can be punishing or not. So the states can focus both on prevention and on identification, right? You try to keep people out, but once they're in, you can still be punishing. And then you can still actually apply some mitigating tools that involve some diplomacy with third states. And you can even be forgiving, saying, well, in exceptional cases, we regularize, right? But we do that under the condition that we are tough on maybe new migrants. So, yeah, so it shouldn't, so I'm not sure. So I think that's all of that is covered by your more fine-grained, let's say, tools, right? But in your, the conceptual model, I think to some extent, doesn't capture that fully, right? So maybe you should think of an indicator that is a more comprehensive reflection of the mix of these policies. Okay. Second point shortly is on the convergence argument. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think the question there on why convergence has occurred is more interesting than whether convergence has occurred. And I mean, these, how you pitch the papers, yeah, reflects a lot of discussions that we also see on asylum policy or family reunification or citizenship. And I'm not sure that you make the puzzle as strong as you could here, right? Because with all of these migration policies, we see that states have autonomy and therefore there's diversity, but we also see convergence in all of those policies, right? We think about asylum, safe country of origin policies, all kinds of, you know, the bilateral externalization. So you see lots of stuff going on. But for me, the question would be, when do countries jump on this bandwagon? Why are they front runners? So the question is more about the timing. And there, I think there's still a lot of variation that is there to explore. So I'm not fully sure that the puzzle that you pitch it now is completely convinced.
Thank you, Martin. We'll take a few questions again, if that's okay. If you're online, please remember, if you have a question, just go ahead and post it in the chat. I saw Christoph had a question.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, this was a lot of work, I guess. Its outcome is fascinating. But my question is empirical. So you coded policy on paper. So you could not code non-executed returns. So how, like you have people that entered irregularly, don't have a status and should be returned, but cannot be returned. So that was the whole question that was dealt with last week at the council meeting. So how would you code this? Would this be, because it's a huge number of people that are affected by this status of not being returned, but remaining in the country. So is that then a tolerance of irregular entry and then would fall within your category of forgiving, or where would that fit?
Thank you, Lorenzo.
Yeah, thanks. It's Philip. It's really amazing work. My name is Lorenzo Piccoli. I find your paper extremely neat and very useful, and that's why I'm gonna take the freedom to ask maybe two nasty questions on the contents. One is, my impression is that what you observe is also that there is a growth of all policies that deal with irregular migration over time. And I wonder whether that's also due to the fact that we indeed possess more information on the latest, on the last 2 or 3 decades. And I was wondering whether you can expand a bit on your archival research and how easy it was to find comprehensive information on the first years after 45, which is very interesting. And the second question that maybe links with the previous one is that a lot of what goes on in this field is a bit hidden. and it's very difficult to capture. And I was wondering if sometimes you have to make somehow arbitrary calls. So for example, on regularizations, there has been a big on-paper regularization in Italy a couple of years ago, but the effects were extremely narrow, almost non-existent. And at the same time, the Italian government kind of introduced the regularization mechanism through international protection, what is called special protection, that does affect a lot of people in the country. How do you code those very complex and again sometimes hidden measures? I'm asking because that's a challenge I'm often confronted with. But apart from these, I really find these fantastic. So thanks a lot.
Okay, I think I'll take one more from the room. Fabian, anybody else who hasn't? No? Okay. Fabian? Okay, you're the next round. Fabian?
Well, thanks for this interesting study. I must say the results were not too puzzling for me. For me, it rather responded to this, what you feel anyhow intuitively that has happened since all states more or less became now in the course of time immigration countries, not immigration countries. They are bound in the common Schengen area without internal borders, and there is increasing international migration pressure. So it reflects my intuitive expectations, but I may be wrong. So I didn't find the results really puzzling, but nevertheless quite interesting to have this analysis, which leads me to my point. Is in essence what you're speaking about from a legal point of view. It's about enforcement of administrative law and how strict member states are in enforcing the rules which are there. So migration law is about who can come, who cannot come, and what happens if you don't comply with the rules. These rules exist. What you examine is how strict are member states in enforcing this. Legally speaking, it's about the strictness of member states in enforcing one specific piece of administrative law. And I'm wondering, maybe that's also for your future research, if you also had looked into other fields of administrative law. I'm not saying it's the same, but you have similar phenomena like regularization also in the field itself, construction and building permits. When you have illegally done a house in someone's garden and then you may get a regularization or not, you have it also in the field maybe related to psychotropic substances and drugs, to what extent member states really enforce the rules which exist. And there may have been other academics who looked into, these changing member state practices, and it may be interesting to compare. That was just a remark from my side.
Okay, thank you. I'll give you a chance to respond briefly to some of these, and then we'll do a second round, including online audience.
Wow, thank you so much. All of these comments are fantastic. I really appreciate it. Let me see. I think to Christoph's point, I think I think I can't, like I said at the end, I can't look at implementation. My instinct would be in those cases, it's a non-implementation of a particular policy. And here I'm definitely only looking on what has been adopted as the official policy. And I realize that is a limitation, and the non-implementation is not, in the forgiving category, it's the adoption of the positive adoption of a regularization program, unless there is a positive adoption of a policy that accepts non-deportable individuals. Perhaps the subsidiary protection policy would fall under that, but the non-implementation would not. But it is a case that's very on the line. So I think I'll have to think more about it. So thank you for bringing that up. But I definitely can't look at non-implementation. It's a whole other area, and it's very hard to actually get at that. Lorenzo, in terms of do we have more information over time? I still think you see. I think it's most pronounced with the regularization policies and the big programs. You see that they are adopted by certain states, that no longer really adopted by those states. Other states then adopt them, then they abandon them. So I think there is more happening than just growth over time. I also think it is true that over time there's more and more regulation, certainly, and I think that follows along with changing realities of globalization, the development of states, etc. It's not necessarily, I wouldn't see that as necessarily tied to more information. I mean, it is, but it's all together. We have globalization, more interconnectedness, and more legislation on migration in states. And then, yeah, looking back historically in terms of the earlier policies, I think there were fewer of them, and it's, I don't know, I don't have anything particular to say. I mean, I did my best with the resources that I could to do a proper coding. I don't know how much more I can say. Did I potentially miss hidden policies or policies that were not as mediatized or not as present and discussed? It's possible. I don't know. I don't, in regularization implemented a few years ago in Italy, I stopped at 2016. So I don't know. I don't know if that one, if you're referring to something that falls in that period, but I don't recall that particular case. So I think as I work on the data set further, try to expand it, I need to be careful for those policies. But I don't know, it's the best I can respond right now. Maybe more questions? Or thank you for looking. I thought about policies regarding terrorism, drug trafficking as another area that could potentially be interesting. But yeah, these regularizations of permits, I never thought of that. So that's definitely interesting. But thank you.
Thank you. We'll have 10 more minutes for a second round. So if you're online, if you have a question, please post on the chat. I know there's three questions in the room, but first I'll ask a question from somebody who's had trouble posting online. Rainer Bauberg had a question about firewalls and why you have not considered them as one potential tool. So firewalls are policies that basically prevent, for example, providers of public services to report the migration status of the people who approach them to the immigration authorities. So we have those in quite, not all countries, in some countries, for some, so Rainer asks why they're not considered in your paper. And because they're clearly a response to regular migration, the characteristic is that they do not aim at identification, but at guaranteeing access to fundamental rights and services. So they could be classified as domestic mitigation policies. And it's not clear to Rainer why mitigation policies should exist only in external relations. And the concept of mitigation is about reducing bad effects rather than about prevention. So why not also include firewalls as a policy tool that would fall under domestic mitigation? If you make a note of that, I don't see. Well, there's another question from chat from Clara Arias. Any suggestion of how to manage the coordination into agencies as Frontex states of society organizations accomplishing human rights? And then I've got a few more questions in the room now. I've got a question in the back. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Susanna Samson. I'm first year PhD researcher. I have a question about where would you position practices that are not in the policies, like implemented in policies. I'm thinking, to give an example, about Poland and the situation on its border with Belarus and the pushbacks that happened, which are technically illegal. So they cannot be in the policy, but this is a practice. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
I had Lucas.
Yeah, I was just gonna also pass on Rainer's question. So that's what you did. So I'll be fine.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, it's a quick question. I had to leave the room, so it might have been asked. But I was wondering, in the context of Europe, whether state interaction as a kind of measurable variable could be a potential explanation of convergence, given the density and frequency of interaction between EU member states through various networks and what's been called kind of intensive transgovernmentalism, which could be applied to this issue area and other issue areas, and could be measurable perhaps as maybe as a direction for work around convergence.
Any other questions? I don't see any other questions online. Any other in the room? If not, we'll just, okay, so please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for these as well. For Raina's question on firewalls. So I did include it under, is my presentation still? Oh. I included it under the category of suffocating, under rights restrictions, and under a better sanction. So under potentially, restrictions of rights to access public services as a way to choke the potential ability of an individual in a regular status to function in the state in question. And regards to mitigation, I think what your question is leading me to think is that mitigation is a bad word. I just picked 4 words to describe these potential 4 categories. Maybe mitigation isn't really a good one. And the way I see something like restriction of access or demanding that public service providers inform authorities when they're dealing with an irregular migrant, as a very coercive type of policy rather than as one that's changing incentives. But I might have to think more about that. So thank you for, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, just to clarify, I imagine on Rainer's behalf, I mean, so firewall policies, so separate from formal restrictions of rights, I mean, firewall policies would almost tell the service provider that, do not report immigration status. So in a way, whatever restrictions there might be in place, they don't apply because you just treat everybody as they arrive. So it's the other way, yes. So it's not a restriction, it's the other way. It's a way of providing irregular migrants with rights that they might not have actually under immigration laws. And it might be possible for you to actually measure this to some extent. Anyway, just to
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. I thought you were referring to the other way around, where they are meant to indicate that they're dealing with irregular migrants. Okay. Thank you. I hadn't thought about that as a formal policy that could be under mitigation. I think that's very helpful. Thank you. Susanna, thank you as well. I think there's just only so much that is possible to code and to be consistent. I've only focused on policies that are adopted, policies on paper, rather than sort of implementation of both those policies and the implementation of possibly things that are illegal, like pushbacks. So I think that's just beyond the scope of where I am now, even though it's obviously very relevant, important, and interesting. Andrew, thank you. Yes, I think the next step is looking at why did convergence occur, and that's sort of the other slice of my thesis, where I'm looking at how EU accession and the development of the Schengen area led to this sort of convergence over time. But I think that maps entirely onto this intensive transgovernmentalism that you're referencing. So that's going to be very helpful for the other parts, not necessarily for this paper, but for the other segments. And lastly, I want to go back to Martin's comments. Thank you for those as well. I think it's definitely possible for the 4 approaches to be adopted. I mean, in the coding, you see the simultaneous adoption of all 4. But I hadn't thought about different mixes. Is there a potential mix of the 4 that is potentially potentially coherent in a way rather than others? I do think that I have my consequences of each of the 4, and I think the consequences are quite different for governments, for individuals, for markets. So I think it is interesting that states are adopting multiple approaches at the same time, given that each approach, I think, is pretty distinct from the others in terms of the objectives, in terms of the strategies, in terms of the consequences. And so, I mean, one initial hypothesis I had is that it goes to implementation. We can adopt 4, but we're really only implementing 1, right, rather than the others, and only, given that we don't want these other consequences to be, we don't want to experience these other consequences. But I think you raise an excellent point that states seem to be adopting all four, and then that calls for explanation why. And is it because my typology isn't that great, or is it something else? I think it's something I have to investigate. And in terms of convergence in other policy domains, both migration related and non-migration related, I think is also something to explore further. I'm not sure. I think it could also be puzzling if family reunification policies are much more similar over time. That could also be a puzzling outcome. But yeah, I think I'd put that in what to develop further. Yeah. But thanks again.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. It's almost 12 o'clock here in Italy, so we'll bring things to a close. I'd like to thank both Philip and Lucas for fantastic presentations. I'd like to thank everybody for their questions, and please take a look at the MPC's website for our forthcoming seminars. The next one will be on the 15th of March. So thanks everybody, and have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.